I stepped into that ballroom holding a pager, not a purse, and by the time I stepped out of it, I had a husband. Not a boyfriend, not a fiancé. A husband, announced to a room full of strangers before I'd said a single word about myself. I want you to understand that I didn't walk into that gala looking for anything. I walked in because my hospital security contract sometimes sent nurses to cover private events in case some board member had a heart attack over bad champagne, and I needed the extra shift paying more than I needed a night off. Nobody told me the name of the man I was covering. Nobody told me anything until a man in an earpiece looked at my badge, looked at his tablet, and said, "Right this way, Mrs. Voss." I remember thinking he had the wrong nurse. I said so. He didn't answer. He just walked me straight through the crowd like I already belonged there, past waiters with trays of glasses I couldn't afford to break, past men in suits that cost more than my rent, until I was standing in front of Nikolai Voss himself, and every conversation around us slowed down like a held breath. He looked at me the way you look at someone you've been waiting for. Not surprised, relieved. And before I could ask him what was happening, before I could even get his name fully formed in my head as more than a rumor from the news, he turned to the man beside him, a man with the same sharp jaw and colder eyes, and said the words that changed everything. "She's not just my nurse. She's my wife." I felt the room tilt. Every head turned. I opened my mouth to correct him, to say there had been some kind of mistake, and nothing came out. Because I recognized the other man's face from a headline I'd scrolled past months ago. Dmitri Voss. And the way he was looking at me wasn't shock. It was calculation, like he was recalculating a number that had just changed. I want to tell you I panicked in some dramatic, obvious way, but I didn't. I went very still, the way I do in a trauma bay when the numbers on the monitor start dropping and screaming won't fix anything. My mind wasn't on romance. It was on my license, my job, the fact that dozens of people in that room worked in healthcare, in law, in journalism, and any one of them could ruin my career with a single phone call if this looked like exactly what it sounded like. Dmitri smiled at me like we were old friends. "I had no idea Nikolai's recovery included a wife," he said, and his voice was smooth in a way that made my skin crawl more than shouting would have. Nikolai's hand found the small of my back, steady, grounding, and somehow that made it worse because it felt less like comfort and more like a signal to the room that I belonged to him now, whether I understood why or not. I didn't get a private moment. I didn't get an explanation. I got introduced to board members whose names I couldn't hold on to, congratulated by people whose smiles didn't reach their eyes, and the entire time my heart was doing the kind of pounding I usually only feel when a code blue comes through the doors. This wasn't romance. This was survival. And I didn't even know what I was surviving yet. If you've ever had a single sentence rearrange your entire life without your permission, I want you to stay with me for this one, because what happened next explains why he waited exactly this long to say it out loud. When Dmitri finally walked away to work the room, Nikolai leaned down, close enough that only I could hear him, and he said the 6 months of silence hadn't been an oversight. They'd been a countdown, and had just run out. I didn't understand what that meant yet. All I knew was that 6 months ago, I'd signed a piece of paper I thought would never matter again, and somehow, it had just become the most important document of my life. 6 months before that gala, I was working my normal shift in the emergency department when the doors burst open and a man came in on a gurney, soaked through with blood from a gunshot wound at his side. I didn't know his name. I didn't know his money. I just knew his blood pressure was dropping and his pulse was thready, and none of that cared who he was outside those doors. His security team followed him in, 6 of them, moving like they'd trained for exactly this. One of them grabbed my arm before I could even get to the gurney and told me, flat and fast, that we were not to call police, not to call any next of kin, only a number on a card he shoved in my hand. I'd worked trauma for 4 years by then. I knew how to keep my hands steady even when the room around me was falling apart, and I knew how to ignore instructions that put my patient at risk. I called for the trauma team anyway. His life came before anyone's rules. Within the hour, a second group of people arrived, calmer, better dressed, led by a man who introduced himself as Dmitri Voss, the patient's cousin, holding what he called a family document that named him medical power of attorney. Our hospital lawyer got involved fast, because something about the paperwork didn't sit right, and while they argued in the hallway, my patient regained just enough consciousness to understand what was happening around him. He grabbed my wrist. Not violently, desperately. He told me his name was Nikolai, that Dmitri could not be allowed to make decisions for him. Not now, not ever, and that there was only one thing faster than a legal challenge. A marriage, witnessed right there by hospital clergy, would block any other claim to his care instantly. He offered me money, a lot of it. He swore it was paperwork only, dissolved the second he was stable enough to handle it properly. I want you to understand something about me before I tell you what I did. I don't break rules. I've never even fudged a chart. I am the nurse who double-checks everything twice, who stays an extra hour to make sure the paperwork is perfect, who has never once in 4 years signed something I didn't fully understand. And I still signed that marriage certificate in a hallway that smelled like antiseptic and adrenaline, with a dying man's blood still on my scrubs, because in that moment, it was the only thing standing between him and a man whose eyes made my instincts scream. If a total stranger begged you to marry him on the spot to save him from his own family, I want you to think honestly about whether you'd sign or walk away, because I need you to sit in that decision with me before you find out everything it cost. I signed. The ink was barely dry when Dmitri was turned away at the nurse's station, and I remember watching his face as security explained why he couldn't proceed. He didn't get angry. He didn't raise his voice. He just looked at the paperwork, looked at me, and walked away like a man revising a plan rather than losing one. I assumed that was the end of it. I assumed wrong. Back in the present, after the gala, after the introductions and the tight smiles and the hand on my back that never quite let go, Nikolai finally got me alone in a private office lined with books I doubted anyone had ever read. He didn't apologize for the ambush. He explained it instead, like explanation could substitute for warning. His father had written a clause into the company's charter decades earlier, after being betrayed by a partner he trusted completely. The clause said control of the holding company could never pass to a single unmarried heir. It required a verified spouse, someone actually living in the household, to block exactly the kind of hostile takeover Dmitri was now attempting through a shareholder vote of no confidence. Nikolai had 11 months from the day of that hallway marriage to establish that I was really his wife in fact, not just on paper, before the vote window opened. He told me, plainly, that he'd let 5 of those months pass without contacting me at all. Then Dmitri moved up the timeline, and Nikolai panicked, and that panic was the reason for tonight. I asked him why he'd stayed away for 5 months if the clock was always running. He didn't answer right away, and that hesitation was the first crack in the story I'd been telling myself, that I was just a random nurse who happened to be standing there. If avoiding me had been purely business, there would have been nothing to avoid. If some part of you already suspects there's more behind that hesitation than he's letting on, go ahead and hit like right now, because I need you with me for what he does next. He proposed something colder than romance and more honest than either of us expected. 90 days of documented living together, enough to satisfy the legal requirement, a monthly stipend for my trouble, and separate lives the moment the vote was secured. I thought about my license, about the NDA I'd signed that night in the hallway, about how publicly he'd just violated it in front of a room full of witnesses. Agreeing felt less like a choice and more like damage control. I said yes, on paper, the same way I'd said yes the first time. As I left his office that night, I passed a locked room with a small window, and inside, pinned to a corkboard, I saw my own hospital ID badge photo. The date on it was 5 months before the shooting. I didn't know what that meant yet. I only knew it meant something, and that whatever this arrangement really was, it had started long before that hallway. Moving into his estate felt less like joining a marriage and more like starting a new job with living quarters attached. The staff already called me Mrs. Voss, and not with the careful, fearful tone I expected. They said it warmly, like it was a fact they'd been waiting to use. I didn't know how to hold that kindness. I kept looking for the catch. There were small frictions that had nothing to do with danger at all. He didn't know I took my coffee black, no sugar, because sugar reminded me too much of the syrup they used to mask bad medicine. I didn't know his calendar had a standing weekly call to some foundation he never mentioned, tucked between board meetings like he was embarrassed by it. One afternoon, one of the household staff sliced her hand open on a broken vase, and before anyone could call for a car to the hospital, I already had her hand elevated, wound cleaned, bleeding controlled, on instinct alone. Nikolai watched from the doorway the whole time, and the way he looked at me afterward wasn't possessive. It was something closer to respect, like he was seeing a skill instead of a body. If you want to see the version of him that nobody in that boardroom has ever met, the version that stood quietly in a doorway just to watch someone do their job well, subscribe now, because that version is about to get tested. My mentor Dana called that same week to check in, the way she always did, and I told her everything, the way I always did. Dana had trained me for my very first shift. I trusted her the way you trust someone who taught you how to keep your hands steady when everything else is falling apart. She asked casual questions about the household schedule, about which days I'd be home, and I answered honestly because it never once occurred to me to lie to her. That night, lying awake in an unfamiliar bed in an unfamiliar house, I realized I'd felt something that day that wasn't fear and wasn't obligation. It scared me more than either of those would have, because I didn't know what to do with a feeling I hadn't signed up for. The complaint arrived less than a week later. Hospital administration called me into a windowless room and told me an anonymous filing accused me of using my position to solicit a vulnerable, incapacitated patient for personal financial gain. They had the marriage certificate date. They had my shift log from that exact night, matched almost to the minute. This wasn't gossip. This was a licensing board complaint, the kind that could end a career permanently, not just embarrass someone for a news cycle. I sat there running through everyone who could have known those exact details, and the list was short. It had to be someone with real access, someone who understood hospital systems and legal filings both. She saved a man's life, and it might cost her everything she built her entire identity around. So I want you to tell me honestly in the comments what you would do in her position. Would you fight a complaint like that publicly, or protect yourself quietly and walk away? I needed to decide fast, because the clock on my career was already running. Nikolai offered to make it disappear, the way people with this kind of money always can. I refused. I told him I would defend myself through the actual process, the real one, because if I let him fix every problem for me, I'd stop being a person and start being a liability he managed. It was the first time I took control of the danger instead of letting it happen to me. I requested the hospital's internal access logs myself, determined to find whoever had pulled my personnel file at exactly the wrong time. When the results came back, there was only one name on them: Dana's. I confronted her carefully, hoping there was an explanation that made sense. She had one ready, smooth and specific, some unrelated scheduling reason for pulling my file, and she seemed genuinely hurt that I'd doubt her after 8 years of trust. She told me she was worried about me in that house, worried I was losing myself in it. I wanted to believe her more than I wanted to trust the evidence, so I backed down, embarrassed I'd even raised it. The person she trusted most in the world might be the one hurting her, and she can't see it yet. So if you want to see exactly how this unravels, share this with someone who needs the reminder that trust doesn't always deserve to be automatic. While I was busy doubting myself instead of her, a new threat was building somewhere I couldn't see. A junior board member sympathetic to Dmitry had started quietly working other shareholders, spreading a story that Nikolai had manufactured a wife purely to exploit the succession clause. It wasn't illegal. It was worse than illegal. It was believable. Nikolai and I disagreed for the first time about how to handle it. He wanted to control the narrative aggressively, get ahead of it with lawyers and statements. I wanted honesty told plainly, because hiding things was exactly what had gotten us into that ballroom in the first place. We didn't resolve it that night. We just sat with the disagreement, two people realizing they didn't yet know how the other one operated under real pressure. I didn't see what happened next, but I found out later that Dana met someone in a hospital parking garage who didn't work there at all and handed them a folder. The legal filing hit a week after that. Dmitry's lawyers moved to challenge the marriage's validity in court, arguing it had been signed under medical duress and financial coercion. What terrified me wasn't that it was a lie. It was that it was technically true. I had signed it under duress. I had taken money. On paper, it looked exactly like what they were accusing us of. The next filing didn't just threaten his company. It threatened to brand me a criminal, and I was about to find out exactly who handed the court their strongest evidence. So I need you to keep listening, because this next part changes everything. Preparing testimony together forced a kind of honesty neither of us had managed on our own. Nikolai told me, for the first time, the real story behind his father's clause. Not some vague betrayal, but a specific business partner his father had trusted completely, someone who'd nearly destroyed the company from the inside before anyone realized what was happening. I watched him flinch at one detail he didn't fully explain, and something about the pattern felt uncomfortably close to what was happening to us right now. I asked him plainly who could possibly benefit from information only an insider would have. He admitted he was already having his own household staff quietly investigated. The court filing, when it finally came through in full, included a photograph of me that could only have been taken inside the estate itself. The tabloids ran with it fast. Gold digger nurse, one headline called me. Next to that photograph I'd never known existed. My hospital colleagues started treating me differently within days, some too polite, some not polite at all. Administration didn't cite the earlier complaint this time. They cited public conflict of interest and pressured me to take unpaid leave quietly for the hospital's image. They're not just trying to break her marriage. They're trying to take away the one thing that was hers before any of this ever started. And if you want to watch her fight to keep it instead of disappearing quietly, subscribe now, because giving up was never actually an option for her. I didn't take the leave. I went straight to hospital leadership and requested a formal hearing instead, refusing to vanish quietly the way they wanted. Nikolai showed up the day of that meeting, not to speak for me, not to fix it for me, just to stand there in support while I spoke for myself. It was the opposite of how he'd handled the complaint weeks earlier, and I noticed the difference immediately. The hearing was granted. Walking out of that meeting, I spotted Dana leaving through a side exit of a building she had no reason to be in that day. The messages started a few days later. Not threats exactly. Fragments. Private conversations I'd only ever had inside the estate, quoted back to me by an anonymous sender, framed to suggest Nikolai had been recording me, monitoring me, controlling what I believed about him from the very beginning. It hit the one insecurity I hadn't said out loud to anyone, that I'd been chosen randomly, used conveniently, and none of the warmth I'd started to feel had ever been real. Someone wants her to believe every real moment between them was manufactured from the start, and I want to know what you think. Was he hiding something from her, or was someone else trying to tear them apart on purpose? Tell me your theory in the comments, because I promise you, the truth isn't what either of us expected. I pulled away from him without explaining why, canceled the hearing prep session we'd scheduled together, went quiet in a way that must have confused him completely. He didn't chase me down or demand answers. He just gave me space, and somehow that unsettled me more than pressure would have, because it didn't match the story I was being fed about him controlling everything. Eventually, I couldn't stand not knowing anymore. I went to him directly, laid the messages out on his desk, and demanded the truth about whether I'd ever really been random to him at all. He went very still. Then he told me I wasn't random and asked me to understand why before I decided to hate him for it. The truth came out slowly, and it rearranged everything I thought I knew. Before the shooting, Nikolai had already known threats were circling him for weeks. His security team had quietly vetted hospital staff at every trauma center near his usual routes, searching specifically for someone with a spotless professional record and zero connection to Dimitri's network. My name came up 3 weeks before that gunshot wound ever brought me to his gurney. The shooting itself hadn't been a clean accident. He'd let himself get drawn into a confrontation deliberately to expose an informant inside his own organization, and he'd arranged to end up injured near my hospital specifically, so the marriage clause could be triggered with a witness his own team had already decided he could trust. He didn't just marry a stranger to save his company. He engineered the entire night around choosing her specifically. And if you didn't see that part coming, share this with someone who loves a plot twist as much as I do. Every earlier moment reshaped itself in my mind. My signature that night hadn't been luck. It had been the plan working exactly as intended. His avoidance for those first 5 months hadn't been indifference. It had been guilt for using me without my knowledge, even if he told himself it was necessary. I was furious. I had every right to be. But the revelation also answered a question that had been sitting under everything else. Only someone inside his vetting process, or inside mine, could have had access to both his plan and my schedule at once. That pointed straight back to Dana. For the first time, Nikolai and I weren't divided by the danger. We were united by it, both of us landing on the same name at the same moment. We went to her together, laid out everything we knew, and she didn't deny a single word of it. She looked at both of us and said we didn't even know what he was protecting me from. Dana admitted she'd been feeding information to Dmitri for over a year, not out of any hatred toward me. Dmitri held leverage over debt tied to her own family, debt that had nothing to do with romance or jealousy, just desperation dressed up as loyalty to someone dangerous enough to exploit it. She wasn't evil. She was trapped, and it cost her everything Elena trusted in her. If betrayal born out of desperation still feels like betrayal to you, go ahead and hit like right now, because what happens next moves fast. Before we could even process what Dana had told us, Dmitri made his last move. With his legal and social routes both collapsing, he sent men to physically intercept me on my way to the rescheduled hospital hearing, intending to force me into a private conversation that would pressure me into recanting the marriage on record. Nikolai's security, already tightened since Dana's confession, moved to stop them, but not before I found myself in the middle of it. I didn't wait to be rescued. Years of trauma training took over, and I disabled one of the men myself in the chaos, using nothing but instinct and the kind of steady hands I'd built over 4 years of emergencies far worse than this one. Dmitri was taken into custody on kidnapping conspiracy charges before the night was over, his legal challenge and his social campaign both collapsing at once. With the danger finally gone, the succession clause no longer mattered for survival. Only one question was left standing in the wreckage of everything that had happened. Was any of the last 3 months real, now that the reason for it no longer existed? Dana faced real consequences, but Nikolai chose mercy alongside justice. He quietly settled the debt that had trapped her in the first place, removing the leverage that had made her vulnerable to Dmitri, and let the legal process handle the rest without interference. It wasn't forgiveness, and it wasn't punishment either. It was somewhere honest in between. The hospital hearing resolved in my favor once the coercion allegations collapsed along with Dmitri's case. My license was safe. My career was mine again, fully, without an asterisk attached to it. Nikolai and I finally had the conversation the entire story had been avoiding. Not a proposal, not a rescue, a real negotiation between two equal people about what we actually wanted, now that nothing legal was forcing either of us to stay. The contract that started all of this is over now. It's just a choice left standing in its place. So I want you to tell me honestly in the comments, does she stay because she truly wants to, or because it's already too late to walk away from what she feels? I decided before I even finished asking myself the question. I chose to stay, not because I was being saved and not because I was being claimed, but because I wanted to build something specific with the life I'd been pulled into. I proposed launching a trauma care foundation, funded through his now fully secured company, and I made sure my role in it was as director, not as a hidden spouse tucked away for legal convenience. The final scene mirrored the first one almost exactly. Another room full of board members. Another set of eyes turning toward me as I walked in beside him. But this time I wasn't surprised. I was introduced as the foundation's director, standing there by choice, not by ambush. The marriage that started in a hospital hallway had finally become real in every sense that mattered. As the room applauded the announcement, Nikolai leaned close and told me the 6 months of silence were officially over. And this time, there was no clause forcing either of us to stay. If you made it this far with me, subscribe now, because there's another story waiting, and I promise you, the next one starts with a secret even harder to see coming.